All right, if everyone would take their seats, we're ready to start. Welcome to the session on religion, humanitarianism, and the G20 policy initiatives. I'm Cholil Durham. I'm the president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. I'm the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. And I'm very honored to chair this panel. I need to announce, unfortunately, at the beginning that Professor Robert Hefner, a leading expert on Indonesia and currently president of the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, has had to cancel, so we'll miss him. But we have a very distinguished panel. I'll just say just a few words because we don't want to take time away from the session. We have to my left, your right, Katherine Marshall, Senior Fellow at the Berkley Center at Georgetown University and the Executive Director of the World Faith Development Dialogue, someone with long experience in the policy front from her days at the World Bank. To her left, your right, is Professor Michael K. Young. I knew him first actually as a law student, then as a Japan scholar at Columbia University, then Dean of the George Washington University Law School, and then he's had a succession of presidencies of universities, first the University of Utah, then University of Washington, most recently Texas A&M, and he is the founder of a new institute on for the study of religion and international affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. So this is we're very happy to co-sponsor this event with his new center. It's their first event, and I'm sure we hope this will bode well for a very successful future. To my right, your left, is Timothy Samuel Shah, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Shared Civilizational Values, a courageous inhabitant of India now, originally a U.S. citizen, but his wife is a native of India, and they have moved back with their family to India, but are working very hard on religious freedom issues, but it's a little harder to travel under that name in India these days, so we recognize some of his good work. He was a vice president of the Religious Freedom Institute, if I got that right. There are a lot of names that do variations on the same theme, so, and especially at a conference like this. And then to his right, we have Kyai Haji Yahya Cholil Staquf, the Secretary General of the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim organization not only in Indonesia but the world, with I'd say roughly 100 million members. So we're very honored to have him with us on this panel. He's of course spoken earlier, and you will see in the course of our presentations why Indonesia has particular relevance to the G20. Let me begin with just a few words about the G20 Interfaith Forum Association. We've been working since 2014, although there are historical antecedents, but to help bring religious voices to bear on the formation of global policy at the G20 level. You will have seen in the advertising that we use the label IF20. We're worried that this sounds a little iffy, but the reason for this is linked to the structure of the G20. As many of you would know, the G20 has not only the summit of global leaders of the 19 countries plus the EU, so it's a little bit of a miscount if you think about that, but it represents really about 80% of world's economic output, and so it's a very significant group. But in addition to the leaders themselves, there are a number of engagement groups, the B20 for business, the C20 for civil society, the L20 for labor, the S20 for science, T20 for think tanks, U20 for urban affairs, W20 for women, Y20 for youth, I think I got all the ones that exist so far. We are operating in many ways and seek to operate like a formal engagement group, and we are on the cusp of being recognized as a formal engagement group. We have realized over the past few years that it is extremely important to find ways for religious voices to be at the policy-making table. I think it was Katherine that introduced me to the saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we have to be careful in that regard. But the reason for IF20 is Interfaith 20 in the sense of lining up with some of these other engagement groups. And the idea is that we will have impact on the G20 process. Now, this is a less formal process, much less formal than the UN process. There's no secretariat, but the G20 does meet at least annually and increasingly more often. They have different host countries each year. The leadership rotates. So this past year it was Saudi Arabia. This year it's Italy. And we turned in some of our interim recommendations yesterday that we'll be going to that we're going to the Sherpa, in the summit. They have Sherpas to help the leaders to the summit. And so we have a set of recommendations that are initial. These will be worked on more over the summer, but we know the way the process works. And so those are going in. They will be on our website, which is the G20 Interfaith, g20interfaith.org. And those will be available there in the next few days. Now, just as Italy is the host country this year, and this has been a very interesting year and a year where there have been a great many opportunities for working with religious voices, and you can guess the range of religious voices in Italy, but also some of the big voices. Next year, the G20 will be hosted by Indonesia. And so we're particularly happy to have Kyai with us. We're already in close communication with both his organization. His younger brother is the Minister of Religion in Indonesia at present, and that body has responsibility for the G20 Interfaith Forum in Indonesia, and we're already hard at work with them, coordinating things that can be done. Well, why focus on the G20? I mean, in some ways this is not obvious because, as many of you would know, the G20 emerged really after the 2008 financial crash, and its primary focus in many respects has been on economic matters. But over the past decade, there's been increasing focus on a range of issues that can be identified with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And for those of you who are aware of those 17 goals, they are very ambitious. They're very much set back because of the COVID crisis, as we'll talk a little bit about today. But these are issues such as reducing poverty, increasing health, bettering education, finding ways to better gender equality, dealing with all kinds of inequalities, stabilizing good governance, I guess is the way you could characterize the Sustainable Goal 16, and then a range of environmental issues. And the reality is, if these goals are going to be reached by governmental policymakers, it's virtually impossible that they would be actually fully achieved. They're so ambitious. But we will come much closer if there is synergistic work with religious communities. And that's one of the challenges, to find those kinds of partnership that work. That's part of what we'll be talking about today. Now, those on this panel have been intimately involved in the struggle for enhanced religious freedom over the past 20 years. But we are conscious that, in fact, the situation, if anything, has grown worse. And so there's been this tremendous outlay of effort, institutions in the United States, a growing number of institutions in governments around the world, looking at how to enhance freedom of religion or belief, but we seem to be limited. And I think as we've gone through this conference, we hear the intensity of the problems, and yet we're looking, I think, for additional, not totally new, but additional ways to further this fundamental human right. And one of the focuses of this panel will be thinking about that. The G20 Interfaith provides a really important forum. At one level, there's opportunities to reach the top-level policymakers in some of the leading countries on earth and getting them focused on some of the key problems. And at the same time, simply bringing those leaders together, religious leaders, academic leaders who focus on these issues, human rights workers, a whole range of people working in this area. The G20 provides a very important forum to bring people's thinking together. And so whatever the leaders do, there is a tremendous range of impact that's possible through other groups. We need at the same time, of course, to work on depolarization. One of the problems, I think, increasingly for freedom of religion or belief is that it's been caught up in some of the culture wars, the polarization battles going on in the media, in government, in all kinds of other places. And we need to find ways to think about those kinds of issues and how we overcome that kind of polarization. I think it's fair to say that it's well known that we'll have greater, there's a lot of empirical evidence that there's strong correlation between greater religious freedom and all kinds of other social goods. What's also clear is that the data is all in the form of correlations, and we don't know which way the causation runs. I think it probably runs in both directions, but one of the things that we need to focus on is how to make those synergies, how to make things run in both directions. And part of things is improving the life in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. That may open up society more to religious freedom. Opening up religious freedom may also be opening up things to some of the other social goods. We need to look hard at what other tools are available, and that's what we're going to be trying to do in this session. So without taking more time, let me turn first well, let me say one other thing. I think one of the interesting things legally is that we are witnessing in many parts of the world a convergence toward greater cooperation and partnership between the public sector and religious communities. In the United States, we see this in the form of some liberalization in terms of the Establishment Clause analysis and the room that's left for cooperation. Many of the European countries have what would have been called for many years cooperationist systems. But how this works out in different cultures with different histories is complicated, and part of what we need to do, and part of what some of the best thinking at G20 levels needs to do, is focus on how to deal with those complexities. Let me stop talking at this point and turn to Mike Young, who brings the perspective not only of having been a university president for many years, but he was one of the original members of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was the first vice chair. I think David Saperstein has been in. He may have had to step out for a moment, but they go back to the early history of the last 2 decades on work on international religious freedom. So let me turn things to you, Mike.
Cole, thank you very much, and good afternoon and welcome. We're going to be a little bit discouraging today, and the most encouraging thing, however, is to see the large number of people with such goodwill who have worked so hard in this area. So I just want to express my appreciation to everybody who is in this room and indeed at this conference. It is true that my interest and engagement in this field does go fairly far back. David and I were the first two appointees, and probably in violation of every ethics rule in the government, we set it up using private money until the appropriation came through. And then I had the privilege of serving a couple of times as chair and being on the commission almost a decade. But even before that, at Columbia, I had the opportunity to establish a program where we brought in religious liberties advocates from really all over the world and helped train them in more effective advocacy, as well as giving them internship opportunities. I did it with Lou Henkin, one of the great inventors of the field of human rights. Our goal was to take people who were irritating to their governments and make them more irritating. And we had some success, I think, as it turns out. But in observing this over the years, I think objective data really confirmed what Cole was saying. I mean, if you look from the 1946, 47 up until the 70s, a great deal of progress in human rights was made. Freedom of religion was not central to that, but certainly a robust part of that. A lull during the mid-70s to late 80s, and then from 1980 really up until the mid-2000s, about 2006. Most of the data suggests progress was made, and the data confirms that we have gone backwards largely since 2006. At least it has slowed, if not actually retreated. A matter of great concern. A great deal of effort in what we all historically understand to be naming, blaming, shaming. I certainly have participated in that as well, and I think it had its place, and I would not say that its place is entirely gone. But as Cole suggests, we really need to think of additional tools and how we add things to the arsenal of tools we have. And that's what we want to talk about just a little bit today. I want to start a conversation, not really start a conversation. I think it's an ongoing conversation, but certainly do what little we can today to deepen it, but also to proselytize a bit for more thought, more analysis of this. And it really is premised on three fairly simple principles. One is we need additional tools. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Two, if you think about all great religions, at heart, they have the notion of compassion and service, frequently not only to their own adherents, but to many others as well. We all know the tremendous number of scriptures talking about in certain traditions of taking care of the widows and the orphans and the poor. We know traditions that talk about the community and taking care of the community. And so that's premise number two, that is a great objective of many religions around the world. Premise three, I think, is also equally simple. These are simple principles, but none easy to execute. And that is, to be effective with respect to governments in particular, we need to talk about this in a way and approach this in a way and allow the governments to accomplish things in a way that are in their interest. And we know that from our own experience here in the United States, as you talk to foreign service officials, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, freedom of religion is not always top on their agenda. How do we move that up the agenda in a way that satisfies other needs and interests? So go back to the notion of religions providing essential services. Even in the United States, a country with a lot of resources, nevertheless, 1 in every 7 people who goes to a hospital in the United States goes to a faith-based hospital. 3/4, 75% of all the substance abuse programs in the United States are sponsored by faith-based organizations. There are 26,000 faith-based organizations supporting people with HIV and AIDS and so forth. Nearly half of all U.S. congregations have groups that support people with terminal illnesses. So we know that there's at least at one level a great deal of work even in the United States. And that goes well beyond just healthcare. 1 in every 12 students in the United States attends a religious school, 4.5 people. The Catholic organization alone educates 62 million children around the world. And in some ways, this goes on and on. A third of, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all students in primary education in the UK are in faith-based institutions. And as I say, the list goes on and on for countries really all over the world. Now, you set that against the backdrop of the fact that 1 out of every 5 adults in the world has no schooling at all. So when you begin to think about these two things, you think, is there a possibility that governments could cooperate, could engage with, could in somehow better engage in a way with these kinds of institutions that would address governmental needs, and in turn would draw on the best traditions of these religions. And by addressing governmental needs, therefore make the government less hostile to religion, more cooperative, more collaborative, and so forth. Is that sort of thing a possibility? Now, we've seen some interesting examples of that during the pandemic. The amount of support and help provided by faith-based organizations during the pandemic. The Salvation Army alone provided over 50 million meals during the pandemic. So is there a way in which we can do good and do well at the same time? And by giving governments an opportunity to marshal the resources of faith-based organizations to provide certain kinds of services that governments historically are thought to be obligated to provide in a way that would reduce the government's suspicion of and tension with respect to religion, make religion more of a partner than, at the end of the day, something to be suppressed and something that is a threat to the government. It might also make the religions, give them a platform for better cooperation, not only with the government, but with other religions, and therefore reduce the intra-religious tension that sometimes is as complicated and difficult as even government suppression of religion. It does something that's at the core of many religions, and at the same time may speak to the interests of the governments as well. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is easy. Not all governments are really responsive to the needs of their citizens, and there may be no space for this kind of collaboration and cooperation because the government is not particularly threatened by its failure to provide these kinds of services, and we can all think of governments that are of that sort. In turn, it's complicated on the other side, that as governments cooperate with religions, one needs to set up platforms and modalities and guardrails to ensure that the religions themselves don't use these opportunities as themselves to become instruments of repression or use the government platform as a way to advance an interest that is inconsistent with notions of free choice, of freedom of religion, and of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. These are just the kinds of questions that are out there. I don't think we have any answers, I think, that are clear yet, but I think it is an area that at least is worth thinking about and worth pursuing, and at the same time also understanding that it may be very country-specific. One of the advantages of thinking about this in the context, of course, of the G20 is that you have a broad range of governments. There used to be a moment in which, as Cole and I were talking at lunch today, you could invite 4 European countries and you would have the spectrum of religious liberties platforms and structures. That certainly isn't the case. And now in a G20 context, we have a lot more governments represented that would allow one to think more coherently about how do you structure that in a way that mitigates the risks that are inherent in this, and I think we would be naive to think that there aren't some risks and complications, but at the same time take advantage of what could be a kind of collaboration that would both advance the cause of religious freedom, something in which the religious organizations are very interested, and advance the cause of the government in providing the kinds of services that itself elevate and raise its own people, giving space to more economic development, all the other kinds of things, more social development, more political development of the sort that we all think is so essential. So today we have, I think, some wonderful examples and opportunity to talk about this, but I do stress I think this is, I don't want to minimize the complications and the complexity of this, but as we look for new opportunities to think about how to advance this in an environment in which we see ourselves backsliding, whether this is worth pursuing both as an analytical matter and then, more importantly, if we can come up with appropriate frameworks as a way of actually propounding this, certainly in the G20 context and in other contexts as well, for advancing the cause in which we all are so deeply invested and deeply believe. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm reminded of a phrase that I learned from him many years ago. I think it was when he was in the State Department, and his comment was, "The U.S. leads by irritation." And I think one of the challenges we face is recognizing that there are some value to that and to that kind of leadership, but also finding some of the ways that things work in a less confrontational, in a way that's less likely to induce allergic reactions, because that's one of the challenges we face as we work in global settings. Let me turn the time now to Katherine, who has vast experience working with the kind of policy issues we're talking about. And Katherine.
My main mission here is to talk about the current moment and the G20. Is this? It is? Okay. The mission of the G20, which is in its essence a crisis management organization, and this is certainly a crisis moment. It's also, as we would say, a kairos moment, a moment of opportunity and grace, turning point that I think our grandchildren will look back to as a major event in world history. So that is, I think, part of the focus of what we're talking about. I want to preface that very briefly by getting into what is a fairly hot topic in the United States, which is religious engagement versus religious freedom. And the primary objective of what, at least I see our mission is bringing the religious work, the religious knowledge, the operational work on the ground, but also at the global level with transnational institutions, much more constructively into the overall global agendas, which we can summarize as the SDGs, in ways that simply were not the case, particularly if you look back about 20 years. So the religious engagement, I worked at the World Bank for many years and was drafted basically to look at this religious engagement, which incidentally was very controversial, with 184 governments out of 184 objecting to being so involved in the religious dialogue. But I think the main point was that it was simply not on the table. And even if you look at the G20 engagement groups, they are not focusing on the religious experience and the religious engagement. So religious engagement should be, to my mind, very closely integrated with the human rights agenda, including the religious freedom agenda, which means basically being involved and bringing experience to the table. And the title of the IF20, the G20 Interfaith, is indeed Interfaith, which does imply, first of all, clearly interreligious engagement, the full range. Secondly, it does involve intra-religious, which is often even more critical, let's say within Christianity or within Islam. But to my mind, what is far more difficult is the religious, non-religious discourse. And that is where we are really working hardest. But the topics involved really go from AIDS to zebras. I mean, they go, every single issue that you can conceive of has a religious dimension. The question is, what is it? But let me turn now to this COVID pandemic, the COVID emergencies, which of course now touch every aspect. And what is the religious community bringing to the G20 agenda? First of all, to my mind, the most important, the central issue is that the religious community should be urging the G20 leaders to focus on the vulnerable communities, the poorest of the poor, who have become poorer during the crisis. This theme of compassion, we're afraid that the SDG agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, may well have lost a decade in the period of the COVID pandemic. So the major, and we know well that the inequalities in the world, the stark inequalities among and within nations, have been accentuated during the crisis, but they've also been made far more visible. So the religious voice, at least in part, will be urging attention, focus, priority, never forget those who are left behind. So refugees, disabled, in many cases women, need for a clear focus on children. 1.6 billion children have lost large amounts of education in the crisis. I was reading today that the sharp drop in the vaccination rate for childhood vaccinations is very dramatic. So those are our central issues. But beyond that, we in this case is the Georgetown University Berkley Center, the World Faiths Development Dialogue, and the Joint Learning Initiative, from early March 2020 have been tracking the impact, the religious responses to COVID, to the COVID emergencies, not only the pandemic, but the associated economic, social, spiritual areas. And I will emphasize a few of them here. This information is available on the Berkley Center website and on a specific one. But the most critical immediate issue is what is called the moral catastrophe of the divided global response, the two-track world to vaccination, which is the vital answer to the COVID crisis. In the United States, Faiths for Vaccines is an alliance, interreligious alliance that is focused on messages, but also on offering and helping to assure that religious communities can be vaccine sites. There's some very interesting evidence that some religious engagement has made a substantial difference in both encouraging vaccination, but also in helping to allay the misinformation that is happening. This has to go global. At the moment, it's very, vaccine nationalism is one of the big worries, and we see that religious communities can play a major role in the massive and very central current issues, current efforts to bring, to end the moral catastrophe and to assure that we, even by the end of 2021, can see a much higher level of vaccination than is the current case. So that's both a priority, but it's also an illustration of the central role that religious communities can play and should be one of the major lessons that's learned from this crisis. And these efforts need to be associated with governments, with other civil society, but that is critical. A second issue that needs to be looked at and studied is that there's quite a lot of evidence that government-religious relationships, which of course vary by country. Each country has its own religious landscape and its own relationships that are driven by history, by culture, et cetera, between governments and different religious communities. And there's quite a lot of evidence of shifts and changes and challenges and tests that are associated with the COVID pandemic. The most obvious is the ways that religious communities are responding to public health restrictions, driven restrictions. That has always been part of the sort of understandings on religious freedom roles is that there are exceptions, security and public health. And public health is, frankly, not a very participatory discipline. So the fact that there has been so much tension in a number of places about the restrictions on places of worship, et cetera, mask wearing, et cetera, all of that suggests that there will be some changes. And it's clear with both violence and protests, legal cases, et cetera, that there's a lot happening around the ways in which the public understanding of government religious relationships is tested. And one of the other issues that's of interest is the understanding of what are essential workers and priorities. The needs for spiritual care, how is that assessed? So all of those are practical issues. A second issue that's vitally important is that religious communities have mobilized extraordinary resources to help those in need. Food kitchens, dealing with evictions, dealing with livelihood issues, dealing with mental health. So again, that's put a spotlight on the vital roles that religious communities play in social protection and where there are gaps, and how this is coordinated with broader social protection policies. The third issue is that in every pandemic in history, there has been a tendency driven by fear and uncertainty to see scapegoating of certain communities and discrimination. And this is happening during the COVID crisis in different places where specific communities are being scapegoated with violence, discrimination, and other associated patterns. And that, I think, ties to one of the topics that we don't understand very well yet, which is the pattern of changes in conflict situations in the world. There's some data that suggests that the hopeful declines in conflict that people have seen and pointed to for a number of years are reversed. But we also don't, there are many gaps in understanding. So again, looking to the G20, which will probably have vaccines #1 on their list, and other COVID recovery. Prosperity is one of the themes, as well as the planet, climate, and people. That in this process, they will need to look, at least to some extent, to peace and to the efforts that religious communities play vital roles in to try to address this immediate scapegoating and increase in minority persecution, et cetera, and to look to the positive conflict resolution, peace-building work that religious communities are involved in and play central roles. So there are many other dimensions. We have, I think, 140 pages of links that we have gathered about the religious responses. But hopefully the G20 will put a major focus both on the vulnerable, but also on these questions about the changing roles of religious communities.
So thank you, Katherine, and I always really welcome and appreciate Katherine's insights into the range of the problems and sort of detailed understanding of the complexities and what needs to be dealt with and how this is really changing the way we interact and think about policy at general levels. Let me shift now to Timothy Shah, and he will help shift things a little, not to say that we've been Western focused. I think both Mike and Katherine are notable for very broad global experience, but we'll shift a little bit toward Indonesia and what's in India, the Indosphere, and what's coming, what lies ahead.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you all very much. Thank you, great. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel talking about religion, humanitarianism, and G20 policy initiatives promoting freedom of religion or belief. I'm particularly honored to be sitting here with colleagues with whom I've worked for many years, including my friend and colleague Catherine Marshall, with whom I worked at the Berkley Center for many years, Cole Durham, with whom I've worked, I think, for the better part of 10 years, and also to my right, my dear friend and colleague Yahya Cholil Staquf, Secretary General of the Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, because he will be speaking next and our time is limited. I will be very brief so I can yield the balance of my time to my Indonesian colleague, particularly because Indonesia will be hosting the G20 and the IF20 next year, and I think it's important that we take time to hear from Pak Yahya concerning Indonesia's agenda and thinking about the significance of that country hosting the G20 and the IF20 for the first time in the history of the G20, the some 20-year history of the G20. I want to just address a couple of very simple questions very quickly, and then again turn it over to my colleague Pak Yahya. First, is it realistic to think that a forum like the G20 could really put religious freedom high on the agenda? I think it's a question, you know, does that even meet a threshold of plausibility? And I think Catherine Marshall is one person who's sort of pressed us to sort of ask that question. I think it's an excellent, important question. Second question is, does the fact that the hosting of the G20 will, in the next few years, shift towards the global south? Indonesia will host the G20 in 2022. India will host the G20 in 2023. Brazil will host the G20 in 2024. Does the shift of the hosting of the G20 bear some positive potential for raising the profile of religion in general and freedom of religion in particular on the G20 agenda? First, is it plausible to think that the G20 could put religious freedom on the agenda? I think the answer is yes. It's interesting to note, and I think many of us may not be aware, I certainly wasn't aware until last week, but the G7 meeting that just occurred in the United Kingdom in June actually had religious freedom on the agenda. My wife Rebecca, with whom I work on these issues in South and Southeast Asia, we're speaking with someone in the Freedom of Religion Office in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government. And he reported to us, I think much to his own surprise, that religious freedom was actually formally on the G7 agenda, introduced, as I understand, by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And the issue that was highlighted was the importance of sharing better and more information about religious freedom. Given that many of us in this room are producing very significant, relevant data and information concerning the importance of freedom of religion, including as an enabling condition that is a prerequisite for religion contributing to the kinds of consequences that Catherine Marshall talked about, contributing to a reduction in vaccine hesitancy, making it possible for people to receive vaccines in the midst of an ongoing COVID crisis, giving people access to education and health care. Obviously, none of those things is possible without some basic level of religious freedom, including for religious institutions and organizations. So it is encouraging that we seem to be at a moment where even the G7 recognize that this is something that was important to discuss. So I think that bodes well for the G20, putting it on its own agenda. Second, it's significant that for the first time, and I think this is worth highlighting in the context of this discussion, a religious figure will be addressing the G20 Summit itself in Italy in late October. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, will formally address and meet with the heads of state assembled in Italy at the end of October for the G20. That is a formal part of the G20, not the IF20 agenda, the formal part of the G20 agenda. So that's another sign of a kind of trajectory in which heads of state of major governments are paying attention to religion. And it may be that the horrible crisis that we have witnessed in Xinjiang province, namely the genocidal attacks on the Uyghurs, an issue about which my colleague from Indonesia has spoken very courageously, among other leaders in Asia. It may be that that clear attack on the religious freedom of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Uyghurs has helped to sort of awaken the conscience of the world to the importance of freedom of religion or belief. So I think it's plausible to think that the G20 will also be able to make this a key part of its, or at least a part of its agenda. Second question is, what potential does the shifting of the hosting of the G20 have for perhaps enabling us to elevate the issue of religious freedom in a positive way? I'm optimistic that it does have that potential, and we'll hear more from Pak Yahya, who is very intimately involved in Indonesia's hosting of the G20 and IF20. But I think the shift of the G20 to the non-Western world, as it were, gives us an opportunity to highlight dimensions of religious freedom that I think are often neglected in Western contexts. We tend, I think, in the West to think of the concept of religious freedom as a sort of individual, legal, and juridical category. It's a matter of rights that some people possess and maybe some people don't possess. But in other words, religious freedom tends to be seen as private property. It's something that some people have, and those who don't have it want it, and those who have some of it tend to want more of it. And the more one person has or one group has, the less other people might have in terms of corresponding freedom. So we have a tendency, I'm not saying this is an absolute unqualified reality, but we have a tendency, particularly in the Anglo-American world, to see religious freedom as a libertarian concept. It's a matter of rights, and a matter of rights that, therefore, as rights that some people possess, tend to be in adversarial, conflictual relationship with other rights, even with the common good of society, the stability of society. And of course, the weaponization of rights and identity has become a major absorbing issue for many countries throughout the West. We're seeing increasing weaponization of rights, even I would say the right to religious freedom, in contrast to the weaponization of other rights. Marianne Glendon wrote an extraordinary book called Rights Talk about 30 years ago, and she made the point that the very framing of these issues in terms of rights tends to enhance conflict and zero-sum conflict at that. Now, I would say that is not the best way to understand religious freedom, and I would say that Asian societies, India, where I am from and where I work, Indonesia, the societies of what I call with my colleague Holland Taylor the Indosphere, those countries from Pakistan to Indonesia that were formatively shaped by particularly Hinduism and Buddhism emanating from the Indian subcontinent. These cultures have had long traditions, actually, of certain forms of religious freedom and religious tolerance, but they're not libertarian concepts of religious freedom and religious tolerance. They tend to be what I would call humanitarian notions of religious freedom and religious tolerance. I'll give you two quick examples. The Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC was the first ruler of a large empire in the history of the world who made religious freedom a cornerstone of his public policy. And if you look at the rock edicts that articulated the religious freedom policy that he enacted in that time, his impulses were not libertarian, but were humanitarian. he thought that religious freedom was the best way to promote the overall welfare of all the people in his empire. It was not a right that he gave to this group or that group, but it was a framework of hospitality in which all the members of his empire could coexist peacefully. Second example will be from Indonesia, where 2 centuries before Thomas Jefferson drafted and saw the enactment of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786, 2 full centuries before that time, Java, the main island of the Malay archipelago, actually enacted a policy of religious freedom. Not framed again around rights, but framed around a humanitarian ethic of mutual hospitality and peaceful coexistence between a variety of cultures and religions. So I think the hosting of the G20 and IF20, particularly in Indonesia, where Pak Yahya has led what he has called humanitarian Islam, provides an opportunity to remind all of us that religious freedom, though it has libertarian dimensions, really is much more comprehensively understood as a framework of hospitality in which all of us and the infinite worth of all persons is respected and recognized, and all people have an opportunity to show each other hospitality as we seek as best we can to understand and achieve harmony with the truth about ultimate reality. So I'm optimistic that this important issue will be, can be put on the agenda, global agenda in the coming years, including the agenda of the G20. And Pak Yahya is one big reason I'm optimistic, and we'll hear from him now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've only got about 7 minutes left because we're facing the next group, but let's turn the time over to you and have the last word. The last word. Yes.
Thank you. Not going to be long, hopefully. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. People work with religion with various different motivation and attitude. So I think when we work with religion, we should ask ourselves, are we truly believers of religion? People who understand the teaching of religions and truly believe in the teachings and want to strive based on the teachings to solve various problems in human lives. Or we just want to manipulate religion for various purposes and utilities for various interests, that are not necessarily really connect to religious teachings. So this is the question that we should answer. And second, we want that religion help us to solve various problems, but in reality, we also witness that there are problems incited by religions. There are problems that are coming from religions. So if I would think about what kind of interfaith dialogue that Indonesia want to happen when we host the G20, we would want that forum to be a forum of believers of religion, talking about the teaching of their religion, about various problems. And before they think about how to solve various human problems based on the teaching of their religion, they should first deal with the reality that the religions can potentially bring problems also. They have to think about how their religion truly become part of solution and not part of the problems. I think that is the ideal of an interfaith dialogue that we want to happen. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, this is a great religious leader who knows how to speak shortly. Very impressive. So that gives us a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. I wish we had more time, but if there are some questions, we've got someone coming forward to get a microphone to take to others. But if there are some questions or comments from the audience, yeah, see if that's working. Yeah. Any questions, comments? Professor Sharfs.
My question is for Professor Marshall, although others are welcome to focus as well. It occurs to me, Katherine, that what you said is really true. We have a global crisis. How do we vaccinate the world? My question is, how can we focus the G20 like a laser on that problem? Because we probably have a year or less to get it right, and if we don't, we're going to pay significant consequences of that.
Well, it's a hot issue, and there's, I wouldn't even say daily discussion of it. There's hourly discussion. Hughes Duma knows much more than I do about the specific negotiations. The question, though, is how constructively to bring the religious voices into it. And my sense is that it will need to be fairly country-specific. In other words, you have quite a lot of experience that's already emerging, notably from the United States, but also, for example, from Israel. There's been quite a lot of interesting experience there. There's bad experience in other places. I'm afraid South Africa and some other countries are examples. So there really needs to be a mechanism where people sit down and draw the experience. There is a PRI study in the United States that has showed, for example, which I think is quite interesting, that there really is an impact of black pastors. And the community has been was particularly hesitant, and that personal influence has shown clear examples. We are working on trying to find some funding, for example, to look at Mexico, which would be very relevant for the Northern Triangle, but also for the southern border of the United States, and really thinking about how would you engage religious communities there and then in the Northern Triangle. That's another obvious place. But it's worldwide. I mean, Indonesia, one of my favorite stories is that the Indonesian government actually hired ghosts, people to dress as ghosts, to scare people, to give them the knowledge that the consequence of not following public health guidelines is death. So the creative capacities are obviously huge. But I think there will be something distinctive in each country and even in each city and local community. But somebody really needs to have that on their radar screen. And that's, I think, our primary function, is to be bringing this, because the tendency, which I think we all started with, that Mike started with, is that these voices are very often not on the diplomatic, but also on the public health. I mean, we started our work actually because there were so many lessons that had come out of the Ebola crisis and the HIV/AIDS and the Zika crisis, et cetera, which had really not been taken into account in the reflections on the lessons emerging from them, you know, in the Lancet and Harvard and so forth. So I think part of our function is to say, don't neglect this topic.
Could I add just a quick word on that, Cole? I think I would never underestimate the power of religion when it mobilizes. I mean, if you think about the abolition movement in the United Kingdom, if you think about the abolition movement here, if you think about the civil rights movement here, if you think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, Thursday night vigils in Leipzig, if you think about solidarity in Poland, and I can go on and on for good and ill. I mean, if you think about the revanchist Shintoism in Japan and the, mobilizing for a less honorable purpose, it can be done very, very powerfully, and there are lots of examples in histories of doing it. Things are, religions right now are largely doing the work without demanding that the governments step up their game, and that could change.
Well, I'm very sorry to see just how fast the hour ticks by, but please join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion. And I'm sure they would be happy to answer further questions, but we'll try to move quickly to the hall outside so that the next group can move in. Thank you so much for your attendance. Watch for the G20 Interfaith Forum, let's see, g20interfaith.org website, and we encourage you to stay in touch. Thank you very much.